Hello, everyone. Good evening from the West Coast of the United States. Welcome to the 8th Getis-Ord Lecture in Spatial Analysis. I'm Jaewon Lim, the Executive Director of Western Regional Science Association. Professor Arthur Geddes of San Diego State University planned to chair this session. However, I got a phone call from him last weekend asking me to serve as a chair instead of him. He doesn't quite feel well recently, but he's relatively doing okay. So he asked me to convey his warm welcome to all of you joining this session. And also he wanted to see you all at the next year's 9th annual Getis-Ord lecture series in Scottsdale. So let me start with brief history of this lecture series, history of the lecture series. The inaugural Getis-Ord lecture was given at WRSA's 52nd annual meeting in Santa Barbara by Keith Ord, professor and service fellow in the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. The second annual lecture was given by Luc Anselin, a leader in spatial analytic studies. Anselin was followed by econometricians Harry Kalijian in 2015 and James Lesarge in 2017. The noted Harvard urbanist Edward Glaser was the lecturer in 2016. The leading GIS scientist and a member of the National Academy of Sciences, Michael Goodchild, gave the lecture in 2018. And in our last meeting back in 2019, Michael Betty, the prominent urban and geography information scientist of University College London, provided the lecture. Today, this year, we are pleased to welcome Professor Shaowen Wang, who is head of the Department of Geography and Geographic Information Science, and Richard and Margaret Romano, professorial scholar at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He has served as a founding director of Cyber GIS Center for Advanced Digital and Spatial Studies at UIUC since 2013. He served as associate director of the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA, for Cyber GIS from 2010 to 2017, and lead of NCSA's Earth and Environment theme from 2014 to 2017. His research interests include geographic information science and systems, advanced cyber infrastructure, and cyber GIS, complex environmental and geospatial problems, computational and data sciences, high performance and distributed computing, and spatial analysis and modeling. His research has been actively supported by a number of US government agencies, including CDC, Department of Energy, EPA, NASA, NIH, NSF, USDA, and USGS, and also by industries. He has served as the principal investigator of several multi-institute projects sponsored by the NSF for establishing the interdisciplinary field of cyber GIS and advancing related scientific problem solving in various domains. He has published over 150 peer-reviewed papers, including articles in 40 different journals. He was named a Helen Corley Petit Scholar for 2011-2012 and Centennial Scholar for 2013-2016 by UIUC's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. He received an MS, Master of Science in Geography from Peking University and a Master of Computer Science and PhD in Geography from the University of Iowa. So his full bio can be found at the link on our full program. And let's say today, the title of his lecture is, as shown on the screen, it's Extreme Digital Transformation and Spatial Analysis and Modeling. And after following Wang's talk, Professor Alan Murray from University of California, Santa Barbara will offer commentary and discussion remarks. We have about 50 to 60 minutes for his lecture, followed by Professor Alan Murray's discussion for 10 minutes, we'll have an opportunity to have discussion and questions about 10 to 15 minutes. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Wang with warm welcome.
Thanks so much, John Wang, for that very kind introduction. If I could figure out how to share the screen. Could you see my screen?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, it's a great honor to give this lecture, and I'll tell you why in a few slides, but also it's nice to have Alan to discuss my talk here afterwards. And I'll start by sharing with you a couple of aspects of my research motivation. And this actually was started when I was doing my PhD at the University of Iowa, advised by Dr. Mark Armstrong. At that time, Mark gave me this Getis-Ord D problem. I don't think I need to introduce this local statistic, given the lecture is named by Dr. Art Getis. The challenge was at that time when I had to analyze a few tens of thousands of data points, it basically blowed up my personal computer. I was not able to do this. So the question is, how do I find sufficient computational resources, some of which could be from remote supercomputers, allow me to scale this analysis to the data points I was looking to. And certainly, if I would be able to do that, not only I would benefit from this analytical capability, and how could I make that available to my peers and collaborators and many more who would benefit from this type of analytical capability. So now you see one aspect of this motivation is flipping the question, if I would have no computational limitation, what would I do with a certain type of spatial analysis and modeling? Now, if everybody's set free for you who are interested to do spatial analysis modeling without computational limitation, what would you do? So this really motivates me, in my research over the past few decades, and I hope to shed some light on this couple of aspects from my research motivation. And the paper listed at the bottom of this slide basically summarized my PhD study experience trying to solve the Getis-Ord D local statistical computation using remote high-performance computing resources, and how to make this analytical capability available to not only just myself, but broadly users coming to online want to perform this type of analysis. My little progress was made, not surprisingly, by standing on the shoulders of giants. As I mentioned, I was advised by Dr. Mark Armstrong, and he happened to be advised by also Art Getis when they were together at the University of Illinois. Now I'm working for University of Illinois, as John Wang was introducing me, so I had to do a little bit of closing the loop happening at a single institution. So really grateful for the advice these folks have provided to me over the years, and certainly it's a huge honor with this kind of personal connections for me to be here to share with you a little bit of my work progress. So if I would be with you in Hawaii or Palm Springs, I would be able to look at your eyes to give me your answers about this question. How many zeros are in quintillion? Now with the Zoom technology, I'm gonna just give you the answer. In fact, there are 18 zeros. Why I'm asking this question? Well, that's the speed of today's fastest supercomputer. The calculation could be happening this many times per second. Now, 2 lines above, about the time I was doing my PhD, this is roughly at the beginning of the century, the fastest computer at that time was able to perform 1 trillion calculations per second. So over 2 decades, we see progress of 1 million times faster in terms of the top computers on this planet. We have made progress to advance the performance. So that's pretty crazy in terms of how fast computers performing calculations. And one of the examples, in fact, later this year, a supercomputer is going to be stood up at the Argonne National Lab in Chicago, here in Illinois, and this computer would be able to perform at least 1 quintillion calculations per second, and also has both CPU and GPU capabilities combined to support AI applications. From another perspective, if I would ask you another simple question, which I hope is simpler since we have spatial scientists and analysts from this community. So where are the locations these maps are telling you? So I trust Alan must know, but again, I'm going to move ahead given the limitation of Zoom technologies. So this is Chicago, the top 2 actually showing Chicago airports. If I would go to Hawaii or Palm Springs, I would start from here. The bottom one is Chicago, and the pink dense spots are downtown Chicago. If I would tell you these are actually mapping tweets, a few decades ago, you would be shocked. These are people posting tweets as they do so because of their GPS devices are turned on. They leave location traces in the social media platform, allows us to capture such traces, and then over a few weeks, you would be able to map out pretty closely to the physical infrastructure of the city. But even more interestingly, because of the dynamic nature of such data streams, this kind of data allows you to understand the dynamic part of urban systems, which again, if you don't have such dynamic data, you would not be able to, at least empirically, look into such dynamics. Now, because Twitter's mobile users, they move around as they post tweets, and they go different places, and over time, they represent population density and represent also population interactions. And therefore, you would infer how urban dynamics could occur, at least related to the population part. So stepping back, conventionally, we know our scientific enterprise is dependent on these 3 primary regimes of scientific practice: experiment, observation, and theory. And until a little over half a century ago, computation has become a major pillar of scientific practice. This is not very long ago. And only a few decades ago, big data showed up. And data-intensive approach is also now a very prominent approach to scientific work. So in a very short time, we see the scientific communities need to close this loop. Traditionally, we were dependent on 3 very major approaches and practices. Now we quickly included data-driven and computation-driven approaches. To me, even just from my little bit of experience, this is in fact pretty significant disruption of how science is done. Now, from geospatial point of view, looking at big data, including the example I mentioned, Twitter data is coming all the time. Certainly, volume is massive. Velocity is every moment. Variety is many kinds. I think geospatial data has all these popular sort of V notions, however many Vs you could come up with. But more critically, look at the characteristics of geospatial data. We understand the heterogeneity and dynamic nature. Increasingly now we have more dynamic data to deal with, certainly massive by any stretch of metric you could come up with, large scale, from globe to local levels, increasingly fine granularity, and allows for distributed access. Certainly that introduces the thorny issues of privacy and security protection. So if you consider all of these aspects, this kinds of data we love and we work with all the time represents huge challenges. Conventional GIS and spatial analysis might not be quite suited to deal with. That's a major motivation of the development of cyber GIS in the past few decades. Certainly, on top of the geospatial big data, there's a movement for GIS to go beyond cartograph mapping to support scientific problem solving and decision making, to become personal services, and to become a design tool. So these are different purposes GIS and spatial analysis today serve that require new theoretical and computational support. As some concrete examples, GIS, for instance, was traditionally good at supporting map-based functions and analysis. Now, increasingly, as example I mentioned, understanding urban dynamics, we want to get behind the maps and see what the processes are driving the changes of the patterns represented by maps. So that's oftentimes associated with simulations. GIS has been good at dealing with quantitative data, but increasingly we also see quantitative information, text data. As an example, we need to combine these two different types of data in a spatially explicit fashion that would be meaningful to problem solving. And increasingly, spatial data becoming spatial temporal data because of the dynamic nature. Again, the example I mentioned reflects this. So oftentimes, GIS was developed to deal with rigorous spatial measurements, with the boundaries and the precision necessary to be part of the analysis. But more recently, the notion of place is becoming more important to deal with vagueness and how do you make inference about place-based knowledge, and how GIS and spatial analysis should be advanced to address this relationship between place and space, and also potential integration and synergy, cutting across space and place. So these are open problems that are really motivating the development of cyber GIS. And there are also some bigger picture problems and questions, increasingly having spatial components. These are problems and questions sometimes referred to be convergent problems. So these are problems not necessarily owned by a single domain or discipline, and oftentimes are related to real world challenges. But these are problems dependent on integration of analysis, modeling, and observation approaches, which oftentimes is not what traditional GIS and spatial analysis approaches are developed for. Oftentimes in the history of GIS and spatial analysis, we focus on specific analytics and instances of methodological frameworks, as opposed to the focus of integration, across analysis and modeling and sensing. But this bigger picture is in the transdisciplinary and convergence context. I'll give you a few examples during the rest of my talk, really making spatial analysis and modeling critical at this juncture going forward, especially with the digital transformation and computational power we will have increasing access to. A simple cyber GIS definition here is geospatial information science and systems based on advanced computing and cyber infrastructure. And if you want to have a little longer definition, this Wikipedia actually does a pretty good job. Cyber GIS has a clear focus on data intensive and computational problem solving, often based on information and computational networks, and supporting computational based collaborative problem solving. there's a recent book Dr. Michael Gucciata and I edited, published a few years ago, that provides a comprehensive treatment of this topic. If you want to get an overall picture of the field, this would be a good starting point. So I'm going to leverage this book for outlining the rest of my talk into 4 components, as you see from this slide, starting from computation data intensive applications and sciences, and then really use that to carve out a few examples of spatial analysis and modeling, and then bottom up to visit the, I think, exciting progress made on advanced computing and the cyber infrastructure, and continue to be exciting, I would say, in the foreseeable future. And then how that enables the development of cyber GIS, and then I'll sort of wrap up in the middle to address this intersection and the synergy between cyber GIS and spatial analysis and modeling. So I would argue computation data intensive applications and sciences are happening across the board of our scientific enterprise and largely our society. And on the right side of this slide, you see the green colored text mentioning some examples associated to each of these 4 components. Well, perhaps the example here is pretty easy to understand. The COVID challenge we're dealing with is in fact a data and a computation intensive challenge. And this is particularly the case from the spatial point of view, as I would show you examples later. So for this project, it's called World COVID-19. You could actually go to this URL, visit this website. That includes a group of spatial analytics. I'll go into the depth of one particular analysis after this slide, but as you see from this screen capture, there are multiple applications, including Space-Time Explorer, Vulnerability Explorer, Spatial Access, which is the one I'm going to focus on, and where testing is focused on how to optimize the locations of testing resource to make the testing widely available, across the U.S. So the data intensity and the computation intensity is very much reflected in every aspect of spatial analysis involved in this project, because we are collecting data not only addressing the COVID aspects, such as cases and deaths that are changing every day, but also population characteristics, as well as healthcare resources also is pretty dynamic, including testing and hospital resources. Now, of course, more recently, the vaccine resources. So these are all captured as digital information today. And how do we manage this pandemic and ultimately get out of this challenge is largely dependent on how well we get our digital resources aligned to understand what's going on and make the best decisions out of our knowledge based on, in our case, spatial analysis and modeling is happening all over the dimensions. Simply because there are so many rare questions, but we still do not have a lot of good answers. We don't know, for instance, where COVID-19 cases are. There are still, huge uncertainties and a lot of unknowns as to where these cases are and where will these cases be in the future. And where vulnerable populations are, we have increasingly better understanding, but still not to the degree we would like. And how to apply different measures to contain this virus, its spread and its impact. And how do we make sure where resources and services should be allocated to serve the population to the best degree possible. So there are all these questions very much location dependent in terms of the best answers we need to figure out, but we still yet do not have the solid handle of the ways of coming up with such good answers. So the World COVID-19 project has three overarching objectives. The number one is to integrate geospatial and population data to create dynamic maps for estimating the spread and exposure risk of COVID-19 across multiple spatial and temporal scales. The second one is create this platform for sharing such dynamic maps and associated data analysis and models with the researchers, decision makers, as well as the public. The third objective is to engage public health, geography, and GIS, and other related communities and stakeholders to evaluate the platform and collaboratively improve its decision support capabilities. So this is very much data computational intensive exercise we are performing, and I would argue there are lots of such cases across many science domains where spatial analysis and modeling play important roles. You know, given this very challenging pandemic, we are part of the process to tackle the major barriers and challenges. You know, I picked this example, and certainly there's no shortage of spatial analysis and modeling examples. And in terms of specific types of spatial analysis and modeling, I'll touch a little bit about each of these types, but with the particular focus on heuristic search. You know, in fact, this is not exhaustive list of spatial analysis modeling. There could be other types, but this gives you a sense of the diversity of spatial analysis and modeling. You know, we tend to advance and tend to be interested to come up with, you know, theories and methods and computational implementations. So this is a particular example. I want to go into some depth to show you, you know, from heuristic search point of view, how such analysis could happen at a reasonably large scale with fine resolution. And I argue this type of balance, meaning between large scale and fine resolution, is happening in a lot of spatial analysis modeling. And traditionally, you often go to fine scale case studies, and you have to really reduce the scope and scale of your study area. And sometimes you need to go to large scope study areas. You have to sacrifice with coarse resolutions. So my argument is now we are well positioned to strike this balance to go to both fine resolution as well as a large scale study. And we need to really figure out how to get rid of the computational limitations to make such kind of studies and research feasible and possible. So a little bit of background information about spatial accessibility in case you're not familiar with this aspect of healthcare resources. It's mostly looking at spatial interactions between the supplies and demands of healthcare resources. And you've perhaps heard of, you know, at the early stage of the pandemic, at least in the US, we were, you know, short of hospital beds. And at some point in the middle of last year, we were short of testing resources. So now there's the supply side and demand side. And how to match has a lot to do with the distance and travel involved to get the supplies to the demands. And oftentimes this is not perfect, leading to spatial mismatch. And grounded in population, that would be health disparities. It's not all kinds of population would be facing similar spatial mismatch. And often those dismanaged populations had the most serious challenges of spatial mismatch. So we have two specific questions in our research. Number one is to what extent Illinois residents have access to healthcare resources, such as healthcare personnel, hospital beds, testing resources, ventilators. Again, that was a kind of a scarce resource at especially the beginning of the pandemic. And certainly now more recently, you know, vaccine would be part of this. And we are particularly interested in understanding what areas may have abundant resources and which areas may not have sufficient resources. Again, this spatial mismatch. There are a few popular methods in the literature One is this two-step floating catchment area. I'll tell you a little bit specifics about this method and the enhanced version of this method. Of course, in terms of spatial accessibility, there's another school of thoughts focused on space-time, prism and travel trajectories. That's not covered in my talk, but it's certainly related if you would be interested to know how that is related to this school of thoughts. Happy to discuss. So we're adopting this two-step floating catchment area method. The specific data sources we've used, including 4 types, hospital data to cover the healthcare resources side and COVID-19 confirmed case data set from the Illinois Department of Public Health, since we're studying Illinois as a particular area of geography, and the American Community Survey for the population characteristics, and rural network data set from OpenStreetMap. So this is our study area. So we do have some colleagues coming from Illinois, so this would be quite familiar, but for others, Illinois is not that a balanced state. So on the northeast side is where Chicago is located, right here. Dense population, Chicago is one of the largest cities in the US, is the largest in Illinois. And we have a small number of urban areas down to the south of Chicago in the state, but the population density is much smaller compared to Chicago. So you see the cross representing hospitals, a lot of those certainly in Chicago, and COVID cases is also heavily located in Chicago. But I should make a disclaimer here. This is a set of maps representing the cases in April 2020. I'll point you to our Where COVID-19 later, which actually has these maps updated up to today. So it's dynamically updated, but this is coming from the publication I mentioned earlier, still showing what was the case in April when the analysis was conducted, the paper was prepared. So Chicago, again, zoom in here, you see some spatial patterns on the left. Again, that's population density and hospital locations on the right. This is the COVID cases distribution. And I want to point out, this is sort of the southern side of Chicago. If you're familiar with Chicago, this is the lake, Michigan Lake on the right side. This part is an area with some minority populations hit pretty hard by the COVID-19 challenge, and it's clearly the case, at least back in April, but still the case, I would say, up to now. Let me introduce to you a little bit about this methodology, spatial accessibility measured two-step floating catchment area method. It's pretty intuitive, as the name suggests. It's based on this notion of catchment. The idea is, if you look at the hospitals, it has a coverage zone. It's like watershed or basin based on travel time and distance, meaning within this catchment, all this population included here has decent, reasonable access to the hospital, represented as a red triangle here. And you could see another red triangle, another hospital has a similar kind of delineation of the catchment, again, based on travel, distance and time. The population within this catchment has access to this hospital on the right side. Now, if you look at the second figure on the right side of the slide, you see the intersection in the middle, which is an area has access to both hospitals depicted here. So the idea is, for the first equation on the left at the bottom of the slide, given a particular, say, hospital resource, hospital bed here, which are service units divided by population within certain distance to this service unit, that would be sort of the first order summary. Now, the accessibility is simply aggregating this first order summary. For instance, for this area is intersecting two catchment, that will be aggregation of these two measures represented for the location inside of this intersected area. So it's pretty intuitive in terms of the rationale for this measure. What's challenging here is because you need to calculate travel distance, oftentimes shortest distance for any of these locations to figure out this area. Imagine you have lots of hospitals and lots of these locations representing the centers of population. That means you have lots of distance calculations to perform. And for large transportation network, this is pretty computing intensive. And the enhanced two-step floating catchment area method released the constraint of the distance decay because in the most basic two-step floating catchment area method, you actually just have a binary determination whether you are in the catchment or not, which is not quite reasonable in the real world setting because, to visit a particular healthcare provider, it's not necessarily a binary decision, right? It's a certain distance ratio. You would say, oh, beyond that, I might not want to go there. So it's more of a travel time zones you need to determine as opposed to a binary decision making there. So if you have multiple time zones based on the travel distance and associated time, you basically set up that measure weighted in the different time zones and aggregate them up together to have aggregate measure. So that's the enhanced two-step floating catchment area method, which is the one we are using to conduct our analysis, but make it computationally more powerful and able to handle the multi-scale analysis we need to do for our study area. So in this slide, you see from the top, basically it's summarizing what I just went through. You have initially the sort of population center based aggregate measure. And then that's based on the sort of the ratio, which is the healthcare units divided the population. And this goes to the right. You need to determine a particular resolution for your spatial unit to aggregate or to express your measure, which in our case, we used hexagon grids to resolve the edge and directional effects of the analytical results. So if you follow through the extended two-step floating catchment area method, that would be the workflow to get you to the result. Now, if you want to scale this up to handle the analysis we conducted, we would have this healthcare units divided by population calculation done in parallel, and we aggregate results, and then to go to the next stage to do the aggregation of per population center to figure out the summary of the healthcare units divided population measure, and then to express that into the hexagon grids. So that would be the final results. So essentially to have the notion of divide and conquer that allows us to move these different parts of the spatial domain into different computing elements in a balanced fashion that accelerates the computational process to get the results. And also because you break up the bigger problem into smaller parts, that allows you to use distributed computing resources to conduct analysis and aggregate the results in the end towards your final outcome. So this divide and conquer strategy has been in the literature of spatial analysis and GIS for a long time, for multiple decades. And I'll share with you, now we're at a departing point from this divide and conquer, and give you some examples as to why. And before that, I'll share with you this result, just to give you a sense what we were intending to produce from this analysis. So you look at the Chicago, and the darker color here means because of this benchmark comparison is your normal COVID-19 spatial accessibility measure compared to the general population spatial accessibility and divided by the general population spatial accessibility to the healthcare resources, in this case is hospital beds. So the normalizing here happening is for the general population spatial accessibility. So what this means is this value higher means particular areas, like this case, north side of Chicago has better spatial accessibility to healthcare resources. In this case is hospital beds. Similarly, across the state of Illinois, again, darker blue colors here indicate those areas with better accessibility to healthcare resources. And you could tell for much of the state here, we don't have decent access to healthcare resources. These are largely rural areas. So I want to quickly go to the online version. Let me move this away. So this is the actual implementation of this methodology on WRSA-COVID-19 platform. In fact, showing, as I said earlier, up to today, the spatial accessibility distribution. So if I play back a little bit, this gets to, let's say, some point in December, I'll play you through. And you probably see, most darker parts are becoming darker, and also darker areas is getting a little bit more coverage. That's good news. Now, if I get you to very early part of the pandemic, you see the spatial accessibility is not looking good. Only certain parts of the state having quite high level of spatial accessibility of the healthcare resources. As the pandemic progressed, you see the accessibility gets improved. So the way of this analysis through dynamic data and performed, computationally scalable way could make this information dynamically available for decision makers to know where exactly are the gaps for additional healthcare resources to fill. So a quick summary after this study, really using heuristic search based on distance calculations, looking at both fine granularity and reasonably large scale geographical scope for the state of Illinois, we could see improved understanding of spatial accessibility of healthcare resources for the general population versus COVID-19 patients. And certainly you see areas identified in which there are imbalances between the accessibility for the general population and that for the COVID-19 patients, especially at the beginning part of the pandemic or the initial part. And we could see which areas have relatively higher spatial accessibility of hospital beds, which is the healthcare resource we used specifically for this study. But the methodology is applicable to other kinds of healthcare resources. Switching gear, as I mentioned, this outline, and keep in mind, I was focusing on divide and conquer as a strategy to achieve the scalable spatial analysis and modeling. So as far as advanced computing and cyber infrastructure is concerned, I want to highlight one example, which is Roger, in this case, stands for Resourcing Open Geospatial Education and Research. It was the name of this CyberGS supercomputer. In fact, this is the first ever geospatial supercomputer. In the past, supercomputers were developed for generic applications and for applications in other domains, such as energy and chemistry and biology. But this computer was created through NSF support to specifically focus on geospatial applications. Because of several arguments we made. Number one, geospatial analysis oftentimes needs interactive support. We have a lot of benefits received, for instance, using GIS, the map interface, to give us feedback for us to especially conduct interactive exploratory analysis. In fact, Getis-Ord would be that kind of analysis. Certainly, our geospatial problem solving oftentimes requires both analysis and modeling, and oftentimes modeling involves simulation. So from a computational point of view, that would be both high performance computing simulation based as well as a big data analytics based. And today's supercomputers, at least at the time when this Roger supercomputer was developed, supercomputers at that time were not quite good at integrating across these different computational realms. And certainly cloud computing is yet another different computing regime, is separate from big data analytics and HPC and high performance computing and simulation. So this Roger supercomputer was created to integrate all these three different types of computing modalities into a single platform. And in fact, now this platform has become virtualized, including the cutting-edge CyberGS software as part of this platform. If you're interested to know more background information about this supercomputer, you could actually visit CyberGS Center website, and under research, there's an infrastructure submenu. You could get to this page and you could sift through some technical details if you're interested in the technical specs of the supercomputer. Now, CyberGS is developed based on advances of such high-end computing and advanced cyber infrastructure. And this is a nutshell representation of CyberGS. In fact, just about 10 years ago, maybe a little more, a dozen years ago, when I pictured this diagram as part of my NSF career proposal. At that time, GIS was still largely dominated by personal computing. I was imagining CyberGS would become such an ecosystem where we would integrate high performance computing with big data to knowledge transformation with visualization and virtual collaboration. And then because of this integration, we need to have this sort of multi-tiered onion constructed that represent new frontiers departing from conventional GIS. And the computational intensity is a theoretical construct to basically have assessment of particular spatial analysis and modeling based on spatial characteristics matching to specific computational modalities. So around 2010, NSF got convinced to fund this project to use some of the early CyberGS concepts and theories to develop CyberGS software. You might recognize some names, and for instance, Michael Child was a speaker of this lecture series named after Getis-Ord, CERT earlier. Here I heard doing well. So there are a good number of colleagues from the community here. So we spent about 8 years trying to figure out from the concepts and the theories of CyberGS to what's really constituting CyberGS software to be a bridge between advanced computing and cyber infrastructure and a variety of applications and discovery and innovation opportunities. So here looking at this, for instance, the WRSA COVID-19 platform is an instance of CyberGS gateway. What that means is to be able to see the maps and analytical results from the spatial accessibility, you really do not need to become a spatial analyst. You actually are able to understand what's going on, harnessing the power of data and computing behind the curtain, and interact with this CyberGS capabilities. Again, going back to my research motivation, this is to democratize the access to the massive computing and data resources behind the scene. And then the middleware is to help connect the CyberGS tool sets with the computational and data resources, oftentimes distributed across different geographical locations. So over the years, CyberGS software slowly is evolving into a small community across the globe. And this is telling you where the users are coming from to access different parts of CyberGS tools. It's still growing, but I tend to think we're just scratching the surface. I think the future could be even more exciting. Now, the development of CyberGS is also associated with pushing the scientific frontiers, both the scientific frontiers centered on CyberGS as well as the frontiers applying CyberGS to solve scientific problems. So we started with this special feature of PNNS in 2011 to outline some potential areas of scientific advances. And there are certainly a lot more exciting developments since then. I'll highlight one example here along the line of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So if I would ask you, these are remote sensing imagery, whether this is wetland or forest, you probably scratch your head to have little clue. Well, simply because these are two-dimensional imagery, doesn't give you much for your bare eyes to see what's there. Now this is a LiDAR scan for the same area. You could get an additional clue because on the right side of the slide, you see some empty area that could be under the vegetation. Could be a valley or river. Now the study area here is again in Illinois, in the southern part of Illinois. This is a county with quite a mixed land use. So the study we took here is to combine conventional remote sensing, multi-temporal Landsat imagery with LiDAR to give us both the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional representations of the area so that we could better decipher the land use types. The interesting part here is for a lot of AI methods, particularly those in the context of deep learning, coming from computer vision and imagery recognition, they're not so good at incorporating three-dimensional information, although a lot of progress has made since this study was conducted to address this limitation. So this study is moving in this direction. How do we take into account spatial characteristics such as this three-dimensional representation and get them into a convolutional neural network, and through the different layers, in this case, filtering out the features associated to land use and come up with the desirable analytical insights. So to a lot of folks, this might look like a black box, but a lot of parameters certainly involved to be tuned here for such a neural network to be performing well. If you follow the practice of training the networks with enough samples and then make sure the parameters are set properly, you could actually get pretty impressive results, as summarized by this slide. Where we're comparing with conventional benchmarks, including non-deep learning methods, sort of broadly speaking, AI method supervised training or basic AI methods. You could see the method, look at the bottom one, is easier to tell. The misclassified red dots are sort of butte types as part of the lake certainly not make sense, but using the three-dimensional convolutional neural network, combining the LiDAR data with remote sensing imagery, you could get the results here making a lot more sense, sort of the water type related features as part of the streams. Similarly, a lot of sort of benchmark sites set up to evaluate this deep learning based method and some other benchmarks from conventional land use, land cover classification literature. So we were motivated because in the US, there's going to be a very national level coverage at high resolution from the LiDAR data point of view, but also the land use maps, land cover database, and LCD here. Although there's a recent upgrade, it's still not to the desirable resolution we would like, or the community would like to have. So this opportunity of combining multiple data sources fitting to this kind of deep learning based methodology represents an opportunity to really advance this kind of foundational data sets for the country. Obviously, the bottleneck we're still facing is coming from the computation data challenge side. So in this case, simple divide and conquer would not work because of the way the deep learning models are working through these different stages, from the processing of the raw data to feature extraction, training, to ultimately the classification process. If we would be using the CyberGS supercomputer, this still take a few weeks to get a decent chunk of that supercomputer to produce results for that single county. Now, if you would consider the entire country for producing an LCD using national level LiDAR data coverage, which, by the way, through the USGS three-dimensional elevation program, that data set will ultimately be available, but is likely more than a few petabytes. So the question is, how do you combine that kind of data with Landsat remote sensing imagery to produce much higher resolution, high fidelity data products? And what would be the computational power you would need to make all this happen? This goes back to what I started with, that big computer at Argonne National Lab would be a potential solution. And I would even argue that computer might not even be sufficient if we would really want to do this well for the entire country to advance an LCD to the degree we would like, with high resolution, but also uncertainty quantified, and the results could be well validated and happening everywhere for the lower 48 states. So I mentioned more of a land cover land use example, but clearly there are examples from the social environment and dynamics side. I already talked a little bit about using, for instance, Twitter data to see urban dynamics. This is a few more examples. The right one is mapping of individual users' trajectories aggregated through tweets, and the left hand is a global map of news media coverage of social unrests. Again, both data sources are coming to us in a dynamic way. Basically, if you don't deal with analysis of such data, you are coming with what you have to do for today, right? So the idea is the data is coming all the time. Quickly data could become irrelevant if you don't figure out a way how to harness the data, because if the purpose is for decision making, you basically miss the opportunities of getting the insights needed for the data you might have. Of course, if the scientific problem solving, you certainly want to have the power of looking at data across space and time in a flexible way. In this case, we have to understand how to combine not only the spatial temporal, but also the human dimensions of information together in a cubic structure. If you look at these data points, they're massive. Think about how many people are tweeting across the US and the globe, and you want to capture their movements and the attributes coming from them associated with their social media posts. This is, millions and billions of data points, and you want to know for a particular location and geographical scope, what's happening there, and you want to get to that scope. How do you imagine your computer and analytics could make this happen? It's very challenging. But I think different communities are working together to tackle this problem. This is clearly not a problem conventional GIS toolbox your personal computer could do. Number one, data is dynamic. Number two, even the mainstream GIS today is still not good at representing space-time interactions, especially as dynamics is concerned. So this is one of the first attempts to show how such a sort of knowledge cube structure could be constructed to incorporate the interactions across space-time and human dynamics, and allows for interactive knowledge discovery. It's a still exciting frontier. Is a lot of interesting research is happening in this context. Another example I want to quickly mention is it's not only just individual spatial analysis and modeling, but also collaborative analysis and modeling, and for problem solving and decision making. This is an example of using supply chain optimization and looking at uncertainty of such optimization in a multi-scale geospatial setting, because biomass, in a number of ways, produced in the Midwest, but consumed by coastal areas. California is a major, consumer of biomass, and Illinois, for example, is a major producer. And there's involved infrastructure to make all this happen that's not adequately served by the existing transportation infrastructure. So there needs to be new infrastructure components set up along with the transportation infrastructure to make all this happen in an efficient way. And this involves decisions made impacting environments. Stakeholders need to be involved to take their inputs into consideration, and of course, economically and environmentally, all relevant. So how do you have all these factors put into the same context and have the spatial analysis and modeling power available almost behind the curtain for the purpose of collaborative decision making, is what this study was trying to look at. But again, this is I would say, pretty much scratching the surface. Lots of potential, and I think as more progress will be made on cyber GIS and new frontiers of spatial analysis and modeling, and this kind of capabilities could be more widely available. I have been talking quite a bit about certain spatial analysis and modeling cases, and one particular important theme across all these cases is the involvement of high-end computing and data-intensive approaches. So I want to highlight this quote out of a geoscientist from Stanford, which basically says an article about computational result is advertising, not scholarship. This is a very strong argument. I don't expect everybody would agree with this. the actual scholarship is the full software environment code and data that produce the result. The reason I'm introducing this is to get back to the point I made. How do we democratize the access to massive computational power and digital resources for scientific advances? And this notion of reproducible research is increasingly a hot button issue in the scientific enterprise, and clearly the spatial community is included in this evolving process of tackling this challenge. In fact, a few years ago, funded by NSF, National Academies of Sciences, convened this study addressing reproducibility and replicability in science. And an important part of this puzzle is really what are the capabilities and methodologies that have to be in place for certain studies to be reproducible. So one attempt to address this gap was the development of CyberGS Jupyter, and Jupyter is quite now widely used data science tool, and the marriage between CyberGS and Jupyter provides this framework for scientists to repeat the analysis done, especially those data and computation intensive one. So I will quickly show you one example of this, which is coming from the World COVID-19 project, and this particular study is the one I presented on spatial accessibility. If you look at this, which is a notebook, beyond the paper we published, go through the data samples and the code and the intermediate results, and ultimately to the final outcome. So if you visit this platform, you could get to this where the platform is cybergsx.org. You could get to this notebooks. This is the first one. This is a series of notebooks focused on where COVID-19. You could view the notebook, but also if you register, sign up to access CyberGS platform, and then you'll be able to open this notebook in the actual platform and to rerun this analysis step by step. And this analysis could access backend remote computational resources, which you don't know how to access. You don't need to know how to access them. So this is the notebook. For those of you who are familiar with Jupyter notebooks, this is exactly looking like a Jupyter notebooks. So I mentioned the research motivation I had, not only just to divide and conquer big problems, but rather to ask the question, if you would have no computational limitation, how would you come up with your analysis? And how would you ask your questions? So this is a report a few years ago focused on how to foster transformative research in the geographical sciences. So the idea basically is how do we come up with new questions people have not thought about, which is a very interesting but tough study. I was involved. So one example, again, departing from sort of the conventional thinking, is this notion, as we argued in the spatial science and analysis literature for a long time, we've been focusing on the patterns, especially supported by GIS, and analyzing patterns. And we sometimes look at the processes as well, but we still have a hard time to figure out how the processes overlay with each other. In a similar way, we would look at, for instance, patterns would be overlaid together. That's of course, happening in GIS, but looking at the process interaction, if you see population movement and you see COVID spread, if you see environmental change, such as weather is going to be warmer. So all these processes are grounded in spatially explicit ways, but how this process could be represented with their concurrent interactions. So that would be a tough question to address, and particularly if these processes are happening in different computing regimes and modalities. So this work proposing a dual expression framework is trying to see how processes are overlaying with each other, and in a spatially explicit way, and also in a data-driven way. So this is an example with advances of computing and with the power of computation in the future. How do we harness such power, not only just to break down big problems into smaller problems, but really look at the inherent architecture of computing now. It's increasingly parallel, and how do we exploit such parallelism to represent the processes that are naturally also happening in parallel in a concurrent way, and how do we come up with conceptual theoretical frames to match such process interactions into the computing environments and resources. So this is trying to move in a new direction, tackling new questions that might have not been thought enough in the past.
Shaowen, you have about 5 minutes left.
All right, good to know. I think I should be able to wrap up. So now the example here is just pushing that a little further. If you imagine these process interactions, such as urban environment, we had this notion of urban metabolism. You have the flows of energy and food, water resources. To some aspects, you need data-driven methods to conduct analytics. To some other aspects, you need a simulation to represent the processes. And how do you, again, overlay this together? I'm simplifying or oversimplifying the interactions of the processes and patterns. But conceptually, how do you represent such interactions cutting across both patterns and processes? So this would be, I think, an interesting driver coming from the study I just shared, and make this as a concrete example. We need to underpin the complexity. Again, this is sort of the notion of systems as complex systems, and how do you really entangle or untangle the interactions of the patterns and process in a spatially explicit way. This is actually coming to the wrap up. Thanks for the reminder of the time left. As I used this for my research motivation, I want to highlight this current situation we're still facing that is, to me, a pretty major digital divide. You could think of me as a guy here, representative. I have pretty good access to tons of data and computational resources all over the country, and even from some other collaborators in other countries. But also I see a variety of folks, experts, colleagues, spatial thinkers. I mean, they do not have this access, but they have a lot of good ideas for innovating spatial analysis and modeling, which essentially is a very important and valuable opportunity to help bridge this digital divide through the innovation of analysis and modeling approaches, getting to this deep computational space, and then allows that access to go back to the broad spatial communities. So I have a lot of times served as a bridge in my career to bring this massive computational data space into this part of the community. So I really hope this spatial analysis and modeling bridge could be more wider and broader to make these two communities coming closer to really pursue, I would believe, massive opportunities of innovation and discovery and tackling many real world problems. So in this regard, education and workforce development is in fact a very major challenge. NSF funded a group of CyberGS fellows. Some of you may be here listening to what I have to say at the moment. And you remember the journey we had together and how to develop the initial tools and the methods and education materials coming from your institutions. But more recent years, we had a couple of summer schools focused on collaborative problem solving with CyberGS and geospatial data science. That was the first summer school in 2017, and these are the folks working together. You might recognize some folks here as well, and where they're from. And the second summer school was a few years ago, 2019, focused on reproducible problem solving. And that was on the campus of UIUC. And I really actually miss those days of fun because after getting isolated for this long, it's kind of a quite fun moment. We always think of having such a bright group of people and a diverse group of people working together for a week. You could actually achieve a lot of things as they are here, got quite excited in the end of the summer school process. And currently, we are still working with a group of geospatial fellows, and all these activities are funded by NSF, again, to, in this case, advance COVID-19 research and education. And the World COVID-19 platform I start introducing at the beginning of my talk essentially is also representing the collective effort by these fellows. So the vision here to wrap up is, as I used this as the outline of my talk, really I see the importance of spatial thinking, critical spatial thinking, guiding this from the top to the bottom, because there are many challenges and opportunities requires integration and synthesis, cutting across this knowledge domains from the sciences and applications to spatial analysis, modeling, CyberGS, and advanced computing and cyber infrastructure. If we're able to pull all these knowledge domains together, I think there's limitless pathways and opportunities to scientific advances and solving challenging scientific problems and societal problems. And the digital transformation is accelerating and continuing. That provides, again, both opportunities and challenges. I think our communities need to stay with this transformation. And my hope is to even become leaders of this transformation as more and more would be part of this, I think, exciting journey. So for acknowledgements, I want to say thank you to these agencies, and particularly NSF, giving us the persistent support over the years, which is quite needed for kind of program development like this area from scratch to this point, and coming from multiple NSF units, basically from different areas, supporting us pursuing this direction. That's greatly appreciated. And of course, people, I'm speaking to you about examples and advances not made just by myself, but made by working with colleagues and community members over the years, learning from all of those folks, their creative ideas, and working together to get this far is truly a privilege. All right, I perhaps used more than 5 minutes to wrap up. John Wang, appreciate your patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your great lecture, Shaowen. It is very stimulating for many of us in regional science field, especially for WRSA members and participants. and it is on a very interesting topic of digital transformation in spatial modeling and spatial analysis. Now, I'd like to invite our discussant tonight, Professor Alan Murray of UC Santa Barbara. Alan?
Should I
Yeah,
stop
sure.
sharing the screen?
Yeah, please.
You got it.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Shaowen. Great talk. Very interesting. And what I'm going to try and highlight is that a lot of these things that you've touched upon have been central things we have been talking about in regional science. But to start, since I know some people are sad that we're not in Palm Springs, it seems like a great winter destination, but I'd like to remind people 2001, and actually I included this because Art was there, we were in Palm Springs. It was snowing in the local mountains. It was cold. It was rainy, right? We're not missing anything. Well, except that it is like 85 today. It's pretty nice. But anyway, Palm Springs. I do wish we were there. So to bridge maybe a little bit of Shaowen's talk and regional science, you know, many of these topics, whether it's some of the spatial analytics back by Luke Anselin in 2010, Harvey Miller talking about wealth data, stuff published in regional science outlets, things we've been talking about, struggling with, considering in different ways. I include here talking about spatial structure because since you mentioned the GI star and Art in particular, among others, talking about how we express or specify it exogenously, but indeed there's endogenous elements about it that we're still challenged to try and address, and I'll return back to this. You talked about replicability and other open science sorts of things, stuff that Serge and others have touched upon, and in fact it was the topic of Serge's address at this conference in 2013, which was subsequently published in the Annals. And on the analytics side, in terms of the different analytics, some of the challenges, things I attempted to address in various ways in 2016, also as a presidential address. And then finally, since it's been noted in things of interaction with Shaowen and Mike in the Cyber GIS, Goodchild did talk about just a few years ago now, some of the legacy issues in terms of how we do things and maybe the shaky wobbly legs upon which those things are really done because of the legacy, how it's been viewed, and invariably computational issues, and how that's indeed in many ways problematic. But what does that sort of mean? And this is what we've grappled with, certainly in regional science and geography and GI science for sure, that historically we've had limited computing, maybe even limited understanding. What have we done? Lots of aggregation, simplify, approximate, you know, other sorts of things. And if only we had more data was maybe the call. And then now we have too much data, right? And so what's quite interesting is we're back to doing many of these things that we did because of limited computing, because we are struggling with those issues. Where I wanted to go with this is that, as Shaowen highlighted, big data coming from all kinds of sources is a big deal. AI, deep learning, machine learning, other things hold a lot of promise and actually have proven to be very effective in many ways in terms of classification, things like that. But we're dealing with all kinds of other sorts of data that's in a way beyond classification. It remains to be seen really the benefits that AI and related things offer in simulation, in sort of land use, other sorts of things. This top image is showing wind and fire regimes and stuff that we're dealing with here in Santa Barbara. But on the spatial analysis side, Shaowen highlighted this reliance on heuristic search, optimization, simulation, statistics. And we know that in general, in all of these, we have some major challenges, and certainly they're accentuated and exacerbated, I suppose, in the cyber GIS domain, in that assumptions. Are assumptions valid? What is it we're doing, and what is the meaning behind it? What are some of the issues associated with legacy approaches and known biases that they introduce? Things like modifiable aerial unit problem, frame dependent sorts of things. And then there's been lots of attention on uncertainty, and indeed, I don't think Shaowen was able to, given the many things, touch upon some of those remaining challenges, but it's a big deal, and I'm gonna come back to that more in a minute. But in some ways, we're worried about other issues and probably ignoring something that's particularly important. And then finally, I'm going to touch upon in my brief comments some validity and significance, as well as how maybe the future and where there's light at the end of the tunnel, better using, and I think Shaowen touched upon this a little bit, using our knowledge and insight in creative ways to exploit what we know and do better in terms of the sorts of things we're doing. So why is it we've skipped over uncertainty a bit? Well, I included this thinking that Art would be here and he would appreciate this, in that when we talk about our space, our weights matrix and representing spatial structure, just assuming in this case that it's binary, we're talking about n squared elements. And then if we thought about how many combinations of things that we could have in terms of structure, ignoring spatial dependency, which we don't do in this area, but this is big, right? 2 to the n squared is a large number. And we're doing some work that I think has been used and abused on Baltimore housing sales, only 210 observations. And if you think about that, that's a lot of combinations of weights matrices. And actually, you probably can see in this background what appears to be just a bunch of mess, but that's 2.674 times 10 to the 13,275 as a number, right? It's a big number, and that's mind-boggling. And I guess one of the points here is that, this is small data, or what we would consider, what Shaowen would consider small data, but some of the elements of computing things, analysis, whatever, is beyond big data, beyond our capabilities. And we have to do things in a smart way, otherwise it's really not touchable in any way. I'm moving more towards my own knowledge. In maybe the next minute or two, I'll finish this up. On the optimization side, Shaowen talked about the reliance and use of heuristic techniques that do various things. And one thing I would point out, and I'm not going to get into details because we talk about these in recent publications, but the challenges with heuristic techniques and the graph that you can see here is that what you see are the extremes, and 70 in this case is the optimum. And what you can see here, and what I'm showing, is this distribution of outcomes. And what this distribution of outcomes means, and it's far from the tails, right? The tails that we're interested in terms of optima and what we would classify as significant outcomes. And those things are hard to find, and that makes, the development and reliance on heuristics really challenging, because they have to be good. Otherwise, it's likely that we're sort of in the insignificant domain, and that's really problematic. On the exact method side, there's discussion on this in a paper with Dao Chin, Papers in Regional Science, but one point I wanted to make here is that a lot of times, like with the W matrix, our data may not be big, and in this case, this example is something like hundreds of units, and then a few thousand potential places for citing because it's optimization. But the point here is computationally, for an exact solution method, one that in this case is employing branch and bound, after 53 million iterations, 400,000 branches and branch and bound, if you understand the process, but we had to kill this thing after 70 hours, and we're only within 10% of optimum, meaning we're really never going to solve this to optimality. And these are the real problems and challenges on the spatial analytical side, that even for what we would consider not big data, the computational process itself, because we have to track things and know what we're doing, results in big data. And therein lies maybe one point, is that the future for us, and this is a lot of the work that I've been involved in, is about exploiting our knowledge and insight. And I think Shaowen mentioned this a little bit, but maybe didn't have time to elaborate. But we've done a number of things for particular spatial analytical methods where we're maintaining rigor, we're solving things super fast, we're dealing with big data environments, but we're not sacrificing in terms of aggregation, in terms of simplification, in terms of approximation, but we're exploiting knowledge that we gain either in terms of structure and representation or other insights about the problem, where we're using that to exploit, for example, bounds to solve things more quickly and whatever. And a lot of this is summarized in this paper in geographical analysis. So some questions, and I'll leave these open maybe for Shaowen or others to talk about, is whether we think some of the bright things of the future in AI and machine learning will enable us to avoid more rigorous and complete investigation of sampling space, only at our detriment, probably, right? We think of these things in a way cheating, but what we know when we really study a lot of particular problems, whether it's regional science or GIS, is that we're usually creating problems for ourselves. And what we know is that Roger or other bigger, better, faster computing isn't the answer, because we're always having more data. These things, there's always more detail, and that's likely not to save us because it hasn't yet. So invariably, what I would say is, what we know from the past is that we have to have caution about legacy and approximation, because there's real biases that this is inserted into analytical methods. And so the future, right, is to make sure that we don't do these things, even though we have these huge computational challenges like Shaowen highlighted. And so with that, I'll stop, hopefully less than 10 minutes, but thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you. And Shaowen, do you want to respond to Alan's points and comments?
Yeah, I want to be as quickly as possible here, because I suppose we want to give some time to the Zoom floor for folks to pose questions. Great insights, Alan. A few points to follow up with what you said. I think I cannot agree with you more on the importance of uncertainty, as well as the notion of small data could be leading to serious computational challenges, because we know certain analytics and their formulations are not necessarily just data dependent, but structurally speaking, they're representing huge computational challenges. So I think the uncertainty part has ramifications due to the nature of big data that could be different than what we traditionally study in spatial analysis, regional science, and GI science. Given now big data has new characteristics such as being dynamic and being noisy and being the data collected not for the intended purposes, and the sampling is now a very different concept than what we were used to before the notion of big data was introduced. So I would say the clarification I should make is the framework we are hoping to establish to push the frontiers of spatial analysis and modeling and associated cyber GIS forward is a rather dynamic one. The existing methods and the computational tools we have made so far, to me, they are largely scratching the surface. But I'm hoping the direction we're setting up is a thriving one, because, for instance, Roger is only a baby step that made the case that more powerful Roger needs to be built in the future to address the kind of challenges Alan highlighted. So I really like the comments you made about balancing the different aspects with regard to optimality and quality of solutions and uncertainty and the analytical rigor. We cannot sacrifice any of those as we enter into this big data, big compute world. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Shaowen. We have questions from floor. I'm gonna invite Ian Dunham from San Francisco State University. Ian?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. Well, first of all, I want to thank you both for such an insightful talk. I just had a few things to follow up on regarding, I've heard a lot about causality versus correlation in today's talks, which is legitimately so. And it's just honestly such a refreshing feeling, me teaching in a business school, but being an economic geographer and having a PhD in urban studies, it's so refreshing to just meet so many like-minded people. So just a few things I wanted to follow up on that I think might elucidate some of the things we were talking about. So in the year 2007, only about 7% of data were analog. Today, it's thought that over 99% of all data, if you think of all the data that's been created through smartphone usage, through all the new technologies we have, 98% is now digital. And who are going to be the people of the future that are able to be the scientists? Well, yes, it is us, but I also want to temper this by saying this. In 2008, the editor-in-chief of Wired magazine made the bold statement that big data has the potential to render the scientific method obsolete. And he goes on to say that whereas traditional processes of scientific discovery seeks to establish causality through the scientific method, big data allows for welcomeness, of course, of messiness, of big, messy samples, not small, exact samples. And the effect of that is that the answers that we are able to generate are based not on theory and not based on our expert knowledge and our biases about how we expect the world to work, but rather through causality and through big data specialists. And so he's basically saying it's the decline of academics in some regard in terms of economic geographer theorists and the rise of generalists that know how to use data. Okay, last fact. In 2009, researchers at Google published a paper in Nature that showed that they were able to track influenza outbreaks using search records and historical data from the Centers for Disease Control. Basically, Google figured out that they could figure out who was searching for flu-related keywords at what time, and they could track the flu 2 weeks faster than the CDC reporting, which was based on doctors aiming it in for. Look, these are real world problems that we're dealing with, and we live in a world of incredible uncertainty, and data is gold. And so right now, I want to, first of all, I want to challenge you. This was a great talk. I want to challenge you, but I want us to remember, in terms of, I'm familiar with the evolution of data. Like Dr. Alan Murray said, I remember the limited computing power, and Esri, was eventually a bunch of sheets that you place on top of each other and a bunch of layers. And, issues like MALP and things like that seemed very esoteric, but guess what? Right now they are really real. And right now we do, as academics, I think, have a responsibility to stand up and have an intellectual debate. And I'm jokingly saying this, but as you know, at the end of every paper, you have to say, you have to justify what are the real world implications and the policy implications. Well, guess what? You know, every single thing that you said in your talk tonight, Jaewon, is completely legitimate. And so my question is this: I'll spare you any details. I know data is gold and you have your own data methods, but what's the next problem that you think we could all solve tonight as a group of like-minded scholars that you think is that we could all get together on tonight and we could really get excited about and leave this meeting on a high note?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights. I want to quickly alert you that what Google did for flu prediction actually got a little backfired some years later. You know, they published results also because they over predicted and then actually caused some flu vaccine, you know, distribution chaotic situation. So just to point to you that there are limitations as well for this kind of big data methods. Actually, Alan brought up in his last slide, pointing out some certain areas I did not have time to respond to, but those are really important areas. What I mentioned at the beginning of my talk is the introduction of data and computation-driven paradigms in the scientific practice is still relatively new. I think the scientific community is still trying to wrap our heads around how to organize and synergize these different paradigms together in a coherent way. I think this is, to my observation, incredible opportunistic time we're living in as a researcher and as a scientist, simply because we're at a point of transformational change because of the new opportunities presented by the dramatic changes you pointed out. Given the time limitation, I want to quickly get to answer to your question, which I think is a challenging question. Without pointing to specific problem, I would say we're now perhaps getting pretty close to tackle prediction problems because of the availability of data and because of the power of methods that could unlock the power of computation. Now we're getting close to conduct spatial predictions informed by massive data resources and advanced methods, both from the conventional realm as well as from the machine learning, deep learning realms. So problems involving understanding dynamics of spatial systems, in regional science and others, we could actually undertake serious efforts on coming up with predictions on what's going to happen in the future. The Google Flow trend is actually an example, is trying to predict the future from the search patterns. But I think from the regional science and spatial communities here, we should be feeling empowered to be ambitious to tackle spatial prediction problems.
Okay, any other questions from Zoom floor? Raise your hand if you have questions and or comments. Okay, I have one. Yeah. Let's see. I'll just give one more round. No questions?
If no question, I'll highlight a final note, which I quickly recognize when I say prediction. This is actually a well-known term in spatial statistics community. Say, hey, I'm predicting these variables and so on. My notion of prediction is different from that. It's for predicting the changes of dynamic systems. So just to make that a disclaimer, not the sort of the notion of statistical prediction necessarily.
Okay. Yeah, there is one chat from Krista, so I can
Just saying that she enjoyed the lecture.
Yeah. So,
all right.
Krista, you want to express your thing?
I think she just said thank you.
Yes, I am here. I just wanted to say thank you. I enjoyed it very much. And although I'm not necessarily in the same field, I'm a regional economic modeler and a fellow systems thinker. So I agree with all of your points and very much enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. Any other comments or the questions? If not, I have, oh, okay, we have one more question. Somebody, okay, there you go. All right, Pete. He raised the hand and let me just allow him to talk.
Yeah, I just had a question is there a concern about security? And when I say security, I harken back to thinking about in Hong Kong, for example, they shut off all the cell phones so they couldn't Twitter or Facebook one another when they were in the process of protests. When you show us all the Twitter maps and you talk about the big data and we can talk about prediction, and yet Twitter has the availability, maybe based on all these data points, to shut down part of Twitter or shut down comments, or even maybe on a not a secure issue, but promote ads in certain areas. But I think more about sort of things that happen that could become a security issue as more and more data are available and more data can be analyzed, and the people that are doing that may have control of the situation or control of the data. Has there been any attention paid to that is really my question, the security side of all the big data analysis.
Yeah, you raised an important question. The short answer is yes. Let me say a little bit more. Again, John Wang, feel free to interrupt me. I could say this for quite a while. The data availability, I think, is the root of your question, because the data sources like the social media we talked about are largely controlled by private entities. Twitter actually changed its policy a few times along the line of making the geolocations components of Twitter data. At some point, they even close to make a decision to not make that, geospatial components available. So we are highly dependent on these private entities to do the kind of analysis I was talking about. But also, this is the notion of data governance, open science, as Alan mentioned. How do we envision the future, in terms of our academic scholarship that has dependence on such data resources, and for the benefits of our society, how do we ensure certain data would be available beyond the scientific research, but also benefit the broad societal mission. These are related questions to what you brought up. You put it in a security kind of lens, but it's beyond that. I'm just framing my answer mostly in the scientific side. It's related to, as I said, reproducibility, because the data could be available, today, but the availability of certain elements of the data might be different tomorrow. And then how would you expect such dynamic data to be captured to support future reproducible work? I mean, that's a pretty thorny question. But also reliability of science. If one scientific team is able to conduct some really important analysis based on a certain data available just in the past for a little bit of history, and then that data is not available any longer. So what's the value of science in the future if this kind of work is not going to happen again? So I think we have to really tackle this from multiple dimensions. In addition to what we were already discussing, this kind of data are different in terms of sampling and being noisy. Sometimes it's sensitive. You need to protect the data because of confidentiality and connecting to personal aspects. I think we're not quite there yet to grapple with all these complicated factors. But at the same time, we understand such data are really important and in many ways valuable. And they present both scientific and technical challenges to us. And they also offer unique opportunities for us to gain new scientific knowledge. But what you raised is absolutely a critical issue. I don't think we currently have perfect solutions yet.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? We overran by about 15 minutes, but we usually have reception followed this lecture, and we had a chance to interact during the reception, ask questions. Unfortunately, we don't have reception this year. That's why I gave you extra time to raise the questions and interact more. And again, no questions. Thank you very much once again to Shaowen. And also, thank you very much for your comment, Alan. And before I end, this lecture will be shared on WRSA's YouTube channel after the conference. And yeah, before we end, final thanks to the committee members of the Getis-Ord lecture. Of course, Arthur Geddes and Sandy Deliver from University of Illinois, and Hank Fulmer, and we also have Sergio Ray, and thank to all of the organizers and committee members of the Getis-Ord lecture, and we would like to see you all in the next year's 9th annual Getis-Ord lecture in spatial analysis. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Shaowen. Thanks, Jaewon.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Art. Thanks, Serge. I think all the folks you mentioned, I happen to know Sandy and others. Hope to get an opportunity to catch up with you face-to-face, not in too distant future.
Yeah, we'll meet in Scottsdale next year. Oh, final the announcement. For tomorrow, we will have the presidential address in the middle of the day with the award ceremony. So it's in your program. We start at 11:45 in the morning. So our incoming president, Richard Church from UC Santa Barbara, he will deliver his presidential address. Please don't forget to join us tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Take care.
Good night.